What is philosophy? This may seem like a straightforward question with a straightforward answer, but upon careful examination, it often proves to be far more complex and rich than originally thought. Metaphysics, epistemology, phenomenology, ontology, ethics. These are terms and orientations of study associated with philosophy, but in and of themselves do not essentialize it. That is what we are here to discuss today. What is the essence of philosophy? How is philosophy distinct from other disciplines? How can philosophy help to improve my life and the lives of those around me? Good day, good morning, good evening, wherever you're at. This is the Pseudo-Intellectuals. That's Chris, Ash, and Paul.
Hey, hello.
Thanks for joining us again. All our mods, Jupiter and Metal, and
guys,
all
thanks.
our uphill regulars, Springfield and Phil and Jim Lockett and Alan Parker, Steve Collins, all you guys. Hey, thanks again for showing up. It gives us the warm fuzzies to see that there are people who show up to care.
Right. Welcome. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for showing up, guys, taking a chance on us.
And thanks again to John for being our technical director today, putting up with us.
Thanks, John.
So, we're talking about what is philosophy today, and it seems like a big question. As I read the lovely intro by Paul, I was going to produce this great thing, this work of art. I had it all planned out, and then I just ran out of time, dropped the ball. Like
typical artist.
Yeah, typical flakes. All of us. But we're gonna be real narrow about it here and start with the basics. Chris is going to tell us about Plato's cave allegory, and then we're going to get into some terms, defining our terms and things that are important to know about going into philosophy. Paul is going to tell us about that. And as we do go into their stories, it'll basically take us from kind of the beginning to the cliff notes of the end of where we need to be to start the whole conversation. Because until you have a sense of it, we won't be able to get to why it's applicable in our lives today, which it totally is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So, Chris, do you want to start off telling us about the cave?
Yeah, totally. Plato is kind of where you start with a lot of philosophy, and it's really kind of clouded by its history with like the church and everything. But Socrates had a really useful story in the Republic called the Allegory of the Cave. And when he used this, it was to describe what the perfect king would be and how he would behave. And he was called, these kings were called philosopher kings, right? So the Allegory of the Cave is that life is likened to being strapped into a chair in the back of a cave where a fire is burning behind you and demons are doing stick figures to like manipulate the shadows. And so everything you see in this world is all based on that. And so it gives you a really limited like ability to understand your world. And so when you start to realize that you're being manipulated, you rip yourself out of these restraints and you start crawling up out of this cave. And as you get out of the cave entrance, you get into the light, and the light is philosophy, but you can't really look at it or see what it is until you've grown accustomed to it. And Socrates kind of says that this is tutelage that lets you appreciate the light. But at any rate, the individual crawls to a still body of water, and as their eyes adjust, they can see the reflection in the pond surface, and eventually they can start to see the actual sun and to walk around and everything. But as they get accustomed to being out in the light, they realize that the people who are still down in the cave are still bound and still stuck in the same situation of illusion. And so the philosopher king's responsibility is to go back down into the cave and to try to rip them out of their illusions and thus help them. But in the course, realizing that they will be killed for their efforts for destroying the illusions. And it kind of it illustrates that a ruler has to be, self-sacrificing and reluctant because they know that they're going to be killed or whatever. So as you explore the allegory, it has a lot to do with how your perceptions are manipulated. And I mean, I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Philosophers love their allegories, don't they?
Sure, yeah.
Paul and I were just talking about that. Everything's a metaphor for them.
Hell yeah. It's a teachable
yeah,
moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just thinking about that when we were talking about Chris discussing the cave and how like every philosopher almost instinctively has to resort to allegories and hypothetical scenarios to illustrate. It's just like Descartes' cogito or the evil demon hypothesis and all that.
Right.
But yeah, when it comes to the cave, I think it's especially illuminating to show that the escaped prisoner, which is eventually the philosopher king, is basically hated and disdained by those that he tries to help, and that's how Plato depicts the scenario or the situation that a philosopher finds themselves in, because oftentimes that's what philosophers do is they dispel delusions, they attack convention. And when Nietzsche even said this, and he's famously anti-Platonic, but Nietzsche even agreed with Plato on this issue where he said, people hate to have their delusions destroyed and they will attack you vehemently when you do so. So yeah, I think that's an awesome depiction of that. And it's such a rich allegory, I think, and it depicts so many different things. But yeah, that's what I have to say initially about the cave. Ashley, what do you got to say?
Yeah, it's funny because people get super defensive about it, and it's almost like they feel attacked. They feel like their illusions are threatened, which are almost as dear to them as their lives. I mean, if it's all you've known, you hear that about like people in prison. Oh, it's all I've ever known, so I don't even want to get out now. But I feel like it's like that with religion or anything else. Like if that's all you know, like, yeah, just let me sit and stare at the fire. Go back. Fuck off, philosopher king.
To be fair though, I mean, if you think about it, Socrates was so obnoxious. He you can understand how people would be like, dude, fuck off, because he's I mean, when you think about his questioning technique, it's very rigorous, but it's also just like he doesn't even want to listen to his interlocutors. He just talks past them. I mean, he already knows what their responses are going to be most of the time.
Right.
But I still think that is a part that philosophers play. We play the antagonist to ideas, and we make people flesh their ideas out more and actually examine what they think.
Right. Exactly. I think that you have to have that kind of language that it requires to do a lot of that rigorous examination in order to describe the like richness of the experience that you have. If you only have like a limited set of words, that because it's never really questioned, that you end up with a limited experience. I think that the amount of words that you have directly relates to the depth of your experience. And so I do think that Socrates was a sophist. And I think that for everybody, a sophist is a teacher of rhetoric, somebody who could teach you how to win an argument. And that was part of his dig, was that he was like, always like, oh no, I'm not a sophist. I never take like money for teaching people this. I only do it to show them their own ignorance and everything. Like he like was like a joke. Like, don't get me wrong, but he had like really useful ideas. And like the apology, that's like his like only like non-dialectic oratory, whatever. It was his defense at his like execution, or not his like sentencing for his execution. But when he said that he was an Athenian and that he would die by Athens law, but not live by its tyranny, he wouldn't admit that he was wrong, but he would die if they decided to kill him. And I think that's a really good reason for draft dodging and, conscientious objection and all of these things that like,
totally.
Like, oh, I don't know. But, you got to make that decision of like, the war policy is not the same thing as like civic responsibility. And delineating that is really useful to have these like stories that are like a little bit more rudimentary, like allegory, I think.
All right, I'm breaking in here, gentlemen.
All right.
So we got some statements from the audience. We got a blue
All
thing
right.
hanging on your forehead. Sorry about that. That'll disappear in a minute. So from what I hear here, first of all, you've explained a few things. None of them are the bigly words that you have listed here in your slides. You've already named many bigly words that I think we need to cover, but but one of them was platonic. To be platonic, just define that, because we hear it all the time. Oh, it's a platonic relationship. What the fuck does that mean, guys? You know, and it's about Plato, right? I mean, is that where it came from? To be Plato-ish? Is that what we're talking about?
Oh yeah.
It's really rich.
Your love
actually.
is like Plato.
Right. So explain that to me, because I'm working on, and just a comment from the audience, by the way, they're having a great conversation. Says, yeah, we know the cave, light and darkness. But where is it? Jeffrey Pearson says a Nietzsche reference was on my mind. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Critical thinking. Basically, this is critical thinking. Isn't that what we're talking about here? Just using your brain, doing more than just kind of understanding that there's more out there and thinking about shit. Chris is like, yeah, that's basically it, man. Basically trying to get people to think.
And that's yeah, I'm curious about that too, because how can you get people to think if they don't want to, right? Like if they want to remain ignorant, you can't really force it upon them. But I think it becomes really problematic when those people who don't want to think in a democracy, basically, because then you're giving the keys to the kingdom to a bunch of people who don't want to know the truth about anything. Although I'm also dubious about philosophers who claim to know the truth, because it always
Right, exactly.
It always sounds like they're, that's kind of what defines like most of these people, is that they do seem like snooty truth sayers, and I don't know.
Not snooty about it. Sorry guys, what's not snooty about it? What's the difference? I mean, I agree with you, but critical thinking was a critical thinking class, and I learned logical problem solving, and I loved it, but we didn't talk anything about philosophers. So philosophy, how are these intersecting here? Because you guys are crossing a bunch of things. I think it's important, and you crossed over into politics, and I'm going to throw this question at you. Can you be anything but progressive and be a philosopher? How could you not be? I don't think you could be both, or not be both. You know what I'm saying? You how could you be someone who looks in the past and is a philosopher? Is that possible?
Yeah, well, I think when you mention critical thinking, I think that is part of what a philosopher does, is they assess everything with an open mind, and I think that's what you mean by progressive, is you have to be open-minded and ready to assess all information equally and then make an educated judgment based on that. But I just think that reducing philosophy to merely thinking is not understanding exactly what it is. I think that it is thinking, but I also think that it's an activity, that there's creativity behind philosophy. And I'll get into that in a little bit. I think we're jumping the gun a little ahead of what I want to talk about. But yeah, we'll definitely discuss that. No, yeah. It's awesome that you're bringing that up, because that's exactly what I wanted to talk about.
All right, so Platonic, what does it mean? Define it for me.
Okay, Platonic, I just think is proto-rationalism. It's like basically when you talk about Plato's realm of forms, Plato, like Chris described the cave, and he described these shadows that people see, and these shadows are merely figments of what the real world is. It's like there's a veil of obstruction, basically, that fools people into thinking they're seeing these real things, and they're not. They're not seeing reality. And according to Plato, the real is this realm of forms, is when you get out to the sunlight and you find the real. And the real, according to Plato, is like when you say chair and then you say think of chair, there's a perfect form of chair in your mind, according to Plato, of which all chairs in reality or in our like everyday experience are nothing but imperfect manifestations of that perfect form of chair in your mind. And so Platonism is the belief in that realm of forms that the real is in fact the perfect ideal of all things. He thinks that those are more real than the manifestations that we find in experience.
Okay, you're using the word real. Does this mean our reality? Is it is that our perceived reality? Is that where you going there?
Yeah, exactly. He's saying that the real world, like you can take two different objects and you can say, okay, this is an angle like a 4, and you can say, oh, that looks like a chair, like he said, and then you can take a real chair and you can compare those two and say, in these ways, these fit that description of chair, and so it's a way of delineating consciousness.
Okay.
And so that was how he approached establishing the foundation, and that's why people usually start with Plato, is because that, and then his pupil was Aristotle. The confusion is going to be what you were talking about with Platonic relationship. That is later. So Plato got kind of kicked around a lot, and then kind of lost until we got the exactly the Neoplatonists with the church and everything. So there's different interpretations along the way, but when you get to Platonic relationship and you use that, especially between two males, that's a reference to his defense in the Apology, which was about him molesting little boys. And so it becomes kind of complicated because it was more normalized. Yeah. That was what the charge was he was charged with misleading the youth and defying the gods. And so misleading the youth was like a veiled reference to his like not charging anybody for like his teaching and everything, but there being this like latent like sexual abuse throughout the society or whatever. But he was the one that gets like burned for it. And so I mean, that's kind of where it gets kind of colorful, is when people use those kind of terms to describe like, oh, we don't have like a relationship. We're totally platonic.
Right.
That's it's more appropriation. Like, language,
that's not what they mean.
and it doesn't really mean what you think it means.
We just know each other.
Yeah, right.
That's insane. So all this, I mean, people have been using that for forever, right?
Right, totally.
And
it's kind of weird, but whatever. Like, but that was like the normalizing of it. And Plato was like he espoused all this philosophy through Socrates, whatever.
Wow.
But yeah, that's kind of the complicated part about Plato, is you get all these different layers, and trying to like understand like what the official Greek text is like a whole field in Platonic study. And so yeah, we're really like kind of approximating, but Paul talking about the forms is probably the most important part of Platonism, because like the cave allegory is a description of what everybody goes through, but in a perfect realm where it's abstract and you can interpret it however you want. But there's other things like, the argument is the, I can't remember what the book was, but is the pious because he's pious or whatever, like the rhetorical devices and everything. Euthyphro. Yeah. Right. So yeah. But Plato is a complicated dude that if you don't read it, like it gets kind of weird, but
I didn't know anything about that stuff. That's
totally.
Wow.
Oh yeah. They were a very Philistine group.
Right, exactly.
Michael Stapleton, just to back up, when you said platonic equal intimate relation or intimate, and I was like, no, it doesn't, but I guess it does in a pedophile kind of way.
But it's been kind of appropriate, so it's kind of gotten away from that. The society uses the language how it wants to be, like how it ends up being used. So.
Well, that's just another case of philosophy just being misappropriated. I mean, it happens all the time. Exactly. It's just like how Nietzsche is constantly associated with Nazis, and he is like almost the opposite of Nazis. Mm-hmm. So,
but it sounds the same. All right, they're close. Nazi Nietzsche.
Yeah, that's just a German. It's just alliteration.
There's a motor significance to those terms. That's true.
Americans are simple.
Yeah, America was very narrowly a German-speaking country, so I'll give some credit.
We had plenty of sympathizers. That brings me to another point, though, that we were discussing, was about how these things are interpreted and about how the words come into being, like Platonic. And we were talking about big P, little p philosophy, and the difference between those, and how it might not be understood if you're talking about like your own personal philosophy or Dr. Phil's philosophy,
Right.
or, you know, whatever. But how you want to describe that for us? Tell us the difference.
Go ahead. Chris.
Yeah. So people, you have appropriated this word and not unfairly, but where they use philosophy to describe attitudes, especially loosely connected attitudes, that aren't necessarily dissociated from philosophy, but just don't respect the kind of rigor that it takes to kind of, when you set out to, you know, like the ontological, the study of what it is to be, that effort is not the same thing as whether you decide to buy organic eggs or not. You know, those are pretty drastically different, but you can distill philosophy out of both of them. And learning how to do that and figuring out how to apply philosophy like appropriately to basically just say, what are the things that I take for granted? I think that buying organic eggs can be an expression of a philosophically rich life. But understanding the difference is the difference between, you know, capital G God and little G God. You know, we have capital P philosophy that, you know, you can evaluate with logic and you can reduce it to its statements, its component statements, as opposed to you know, the everyday, the small P philosophies of, you know, I think that, you know, Bernie should have won. That's not a big P philosophy because it doesn't really fit the same kind of rigor, but it does fit a well-reasoned attitude that would fit as a philosophy, I would say. I mean,
well, and you could substantiate your philosophy of loving Bernie with another deeper philosophy.
Mhm.
And I think that's the difference between big P and little P, is there's just more like hyper specialization when it comes to big P philosophy, you know, and like knowing the terms ontology, phenomenology, epistemology, all that is important for that. But the little P philosophy, I think, is just as important, because it makes your brain used to thinking, and it makes your brain used to analysis, and
it's more immediate.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think just constantly being open-minded and critical and, you know, soaking up existence for what it is an important thing. And you don't need, I think philosophy just provides more valuable tools to make sense of the things that we're always trying to make sense of.
Right. Like the despair of Trump and everything that everybody's like trying to figure out, like, what is the role of like savage government in our day-to-day lives? Like, how do we interpret that?
Absolutely.
Did you turn to the Democratic Party? Like, is that like a way to engage that?
Right. Yeah. And there are all kinds of aspects like that we incorporate into it. And those are our little P philosophy opinions. Is there a place for opinions in the larger, the more, because Nietzsche, when we were talking about Nietzsche, the things that stand out to me are more of his opinions, or the things that I read that didn't necessarily express or define philosophy for me, but exemplified it, or was this like a thought experiment or something like that.
Right.
And so how does that fit in to the lexicon? Like, how do opinions fit into that if it's so rigorous?
You guys got me thinking here, like a nerd though. Although you're nerds, you're philosophy nerds, but I just
Nerd away.
Yeah,
nerd it up.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying. Please correct me because I know I'm wrong. It sounds like you're saying that philosophy is sort of a framework. These different philosophies, different frameworks for thinking about the shit you want to think about, and stuff that hasn't been thought about a lot, like your initial thoughts, like Trump's a dick or I love Bernie, right? Maybe you put a lot of thought into that. Maybe you haven't, but has it been put through philosophical rigor? Meaning, you know, like, did you run it through the framework, or you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Is that close?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, to kind of try to fit both of those, the whole point is to think. Like, that's ultimately the only function, is to challenge your brain to handle more sophisticated systems, right? That's ultimately the whole goal, is to be able to subtly manage difficult information in a productive way and to not be overwhelmed by it. And so as you exercise your brain, as you expand it to think, well, what is thinking? Like, what does my brain do to translate my thoughts into lived experience, right? As you do that, it breaks apart your expectations of the day and how you interact with your environment. And that's, I think, what the cave does really beautifully, is it demonstrates that it's easy to entertain illusion, to be, just engaged in what you're going to do at work tomorrow and what you're going to do when you're done with that, and then what time you go to bed. That it takes effort to take control of your life. And when you talk about freedom, especially the word freedom, there is a really rich literature on what freedom is, and to do things like for violence to precipitate it. Yeah. That is not conducive to freedom. That is total dependence. And so when you talk about freedom, the more you explore it and say, well, what is it? You get a better sense of what it means to be not free, and how the difficulties lie in mostly perception of the importance of the day-to-day world, I think doing events like this, like talking to people, gives you an opportunity to enrich your life, and you get a kind of a reciprocal, a boost of enthusiasm for interacting with people and congregating and talking, in the chat and everything. And I think that philosophy is a framework, like you were saying, to allow everybody to effectively exchange information. So you're not trying to recalibrate with little p's all the time,
Sure.
Totally.
Nice.
It's hard to get on the same page with people, though. And so do you still think that understanding of the big P philosophy is what'll help us to do that? And how do we not sound like that line in Idiocracy where he says, Joe was just talking in a normal voice, but to everybody else, he sounded pompous and faggy. You're just, how do you not sound like, how do you get through to somebody who feels like that, like, just shut up, you're using big words, just shut up. And
right.
I don't,
Einstein said, if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it well enough. And I think that is a good metric, a good way to judge how well you know something. And the only way to get better at it is to describe it and to try to articulate it, to simplify it. And so I think thinking is more of a muscle than it is like an abstract program that just processes your stimuli. Like, I think that you have to think in order to get better at thinking. And I think that it's challenging yourself. And so, especially when we talk about philosophy, it is not about going to sit down to learn the rules of logic, which, if that's how you approach philosophy, that is excellent. Philosophy was a tradition that science came out of. So every science person out there, scientist, science student, whatever, would be pursuing philosophy if we were talking 1,000
Well, yeah,
years
it was
ago
originally
or
called
before.
natural philosophy.
Right, exactly. If you studied at the Lyceum or the Academy, you were dealing with philosophers, and those were these schools, right? So these are exercises that you can use to distill meaning out of these other disciplines, just as well as reading a textbook on it, if you have the right kind of mindset. And I think that just comes down to flexibility. Are you flexible enough to handle this delicate, flower of a story, and to appreciate it for its own sake, and to allow it to influence your thinking, which ultimately is, I think, the mark of a thinker, is being involved with the information. So when you talk about big P philosophy and you talk about the difference between ontology and epistemology, like the study of being and the study of how you know what you know and what it is to know, those seem kind of similar, but when you really get down to it, they have different categorical levels, and appreciating that, I think, gives you sophistication in your thinking to how you can understand your world. You know, studying Eastern philosophy would complement, you know, growing up Catholic.
All right. I'm putting a break on this right now because I think I heard something very important here, and I want to ask you this. You guys are talking about you told me that philosophy was the original science. Science came out of philosophy. It's basically thinking about thinking, figuring out, organizing your thinking, right? Figuring out how we're thinking about stuff. Hey, we're not just thinking about what I'm going to do for the next 2 minutes. We're thinking about other shit, big shit, deep shit, right? And then from that developed other things. It sounds to me, though, like one of the problems we have here today.
That thought grew legs and walked up on land.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yes. The evolving of our conversational concepts, right, from way back when. But it seems to me like there's a prerequisite here of having not the desire, but an education. You got to be educated. You can't just be philosophizing without having a handle on vocabulary or comprehension or some basic rudimentary stuff. And I'm talking more than like what we end up with out of the, I don't know. This is where I'm going. Where would you place education? How educated do you have to be to philosophize?
You have to be privileged enough to have the luxury to be able to think about your own damn thoughts. So there's that part of it, I'd say.
So your basic needs need to be met is where you're going. You're not achieving this if you're in survival mode, Maslow's bottom rung there.
Maslow's hierarchy, right?
Yeah, that's where I was going. That's where I was going here. Not a lot of philosophizing going to be happening when you're looking for water or food, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you'll always prioritize in your life. And yeah, that is absolutely true. I don't think that, and this is one of my favorite words, I don't think you have to be bougie in order to access philosophy. I think you have to have effort. And I think that there is definitely a limit if you're going to talk about access to libraries. Sure. But you can take a library and you can turn it into an education if you really, and I'm not saying pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I'm saying that the pursuit of knowledge is not limited to access. It is just limited by enthusiasm. So you could take a Bible and you can learn meaningful philosophical metrics and systems through that vehicle, or you could take Buddhist philosophy. You could take the kitchen manual and you can find meaning out of it if you're so inclined.
Sure.
I mean, look at
but
for a minute there when you said knowledge is not limited, I mean by access, it's like, but it
right.
It is
kind of, yeah.
I
mean, that was the whole point about Plato. Plato was totally lost to the Western world until the Crusades or whatever, when they brought the books back from the Islamic temples or whatever. But yeah, that was the thing, is that they were only available in the past 1,000 years or whatever. But that they were known about and then were found out, and there was like a revival in it, and it was the classical period. I don't know, whatever.
But it sounds like, I mean, if that's the thing, you only have access to the kitchen manual, cookbook, and then you could develop some wise cooking wisdom. Maybe I mean, you would develop your own little p philosophy, probably riddled with metaphors about how the world is a soup and we're just stewing in it, or whatever. But if you don't have access to to other ways of, well, for one thing, other little p philosophies, I think is important to have access to, because you don't know, you can't fully flesh out your own methods and modalities until you know how other people operate.
That's kind of where I was going with that, is just saying well, anyway, but point on what you're saying though about the cookbook or whatever from gonna mess your name, Kate. Look at what Perzag did. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, Persig. Hell yeah.
yeah.
I had
It's
to
been
read
a
that for
while since
ethics.
I read it, yeah. But
So what is that?
and there's that, and there's like Gary Zukov. I love people that do place their philosophy in interesting ways like that, either through science and stuff like that. I know Zukov's a little woo-woo, but interesting points to be made anyway. The Tao of Physics, Friedhof Capra, and stuff like that. But yeah, Zen and the art. Again, it goes back to the practical application of it. And people who my wife gardens. You know, a lot of people go to church. You do have to give yourself that time to be able to. I run. You know, I try to run at least 3 times a week, and it clears my head. It gives me that sense of being able to think and to reframe all the negative shit that's going on and whatever. And it's again, I'm still trying to, after our discussion about big P and little p, I'm trying to parse out exactly what the difference is. But I think that that's part of it is.
Okay. So the unfortunate part about this is that the little p for Plato would be understanding the movements of the shadows on the wall in the back and finding a pattern for them. Mm-hmm. And so for him, and that's what tutelage ended up being, was where he said that you have to learn what philosophy was. And that was the effort of crawling up out of the cave. I don't believe that. I think that's a really authoritarian approach to it, trying to tell you that it will be given to you.
Right.
And that was that.
It sounds like you're telling me that he would say that the meaning that I put onto life isn't valid.
No. He would say that the stimuli that you're depending on are not illuminated by philosophy, and consequently, what you believe is not real. But that's not fair, because it means that you're not thinking. And that ultimately is the point, is that you're using the same faculties to understand the shadows in the cave as you are appreciating philosophy in the light or in the dark. And I don't think that it's fair to demand that the person find some kind of mentor to bring them out of the cave. I think that ultimately is the point that you have to get to with Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, or a lot of these books, is that you can find meaning in day-to-day activities, and doing so you have as rich of a life through that system that you've developed on your own as you would by taking part of somebody else's. So while it's a good teaching tool, it's not universal. So it's not like you have to, understand the allegory of the cave in order to be a philosopher. It just means that you can use the same tools that the rest of your culture depends on. So access to culture, I would say, is different than access to philosophy.
All right.
I have to mention before we get any further, we did lose our big P.
We did.
Yeah.
We lost Paul. I don't know what happened to him.
But Paul's gone.
I got some text messages.
R.I.P. Okay. Yeah, check it out. But I imagine it's probably like a snowflake or something. It's
yeah, it has bad connection out there.
His internet connection is down.
Well, that's welcome to developing nation, America.
Pay your bill, Pablo.
So
see, there you go. To philosophize, you got to pay your power bill, your internet bill.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So, yep.
So how do we philosophize in what not how do we? You just said that I can pretty much find meaning in anything if I want to, which is fine. Why would I want to right now? And what value can we put on it with what's going on with things? What can we do with philosophy that's helpful for the revolution? That's my question. Yeah.
Well, I think just like what Chris said, is you're asking questions, and that's probably the most important thing. Well,
right.
All right.
I would say that listening to the answers.
So listening more than asking,
important,
right?
Yeah.
Listening.
Right. And I feel like liberals, progressives. I don't know exactly how to label the people who do this, or the people I hang out with, but certain lefties, they are good at speaking and speaking their point eloquently, but then they don't listen.
Right.
And I read after the primaries, because I was reading up on Hillary, and I thought, give her the benefit of the doubt and all this kind of stuff. And I was reading up about how people that did know her described her as a very good listener, and I thought about how I wonder if that aloofness, I don't, sometimes I felt like my listening has been taken as some sort of and my appeal to, I want to make one single point here, but I'm having a hard time at it. But basically, the way that I'm read doesn't reflect my true nature. People will feel like if I'm just asking a question that I want to know the answer to, like, don't you think it sounds racist when you say that? And I'm not applying judgment to it, or it may sound like I am, but I'm really not. And so there's that level of communication that I don't know how to also to figure out.
Can I just jump in there real quick on that?
Yeah.
On that,
Yeah,
because
totally.
you just said, I was married to a marriage and family therapist for 10 years. So so as far as you just said, don't you? Your question was, don't you think that sounds racist when you say that? And the way you turn that around is,
true.
I feel that sounds racist.
Right.
You got to take responsibility for it's either
if
you're going into that.
Appreciating that there is mutual responsibility in a situation is difficult unless that's been challenged before. Unless you're familiar with those kind of experiences, and especially unless you've had positive experiences being vulnerable in those kind of events,
right?
Unless you explore these more sophisticated subjects, it will seem like they are daunting and intimidating, and that those damn liberals live in their ivory towers and can't really give us a practical solution to blah 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 whatever. That's just all a perception of exclusion, and I don't think that you have any better of a day for reading Plato. That I really like the Apology. The rest of it I have a really hard time reading. That is a-okay. I personally, and I don't mean to be like a charlatan or whatever, I think that SparkNotes can get you really far in understanding these kind of things, and that if you are interested enough in what the SparkNotes or whatever talks about, what the Wikipedia article talks about, that to go read it then afterwards will just be an effort in exploring that lack of knowledge that you have, and it puts it into its place, because those shortcuts I don't think are bad, just as long as they're always appreciated as being shortcuts. That the richness of what you get out of actually reading the material is difficult, but the richness is so worth it. That I love reading Slavoj Žižek. I do not agree with him a lot, and that's okay. I also love Ayn Rand, but you have to read it in a really weird way. And so you guys got criticisms like, I'll field them or whatever. But if you can read these books and discuss these subjects of what is materialism, like what is capitalism, and how do those two things fit together, then a lot of the architecture of your assumptions and how people interact falls apart with a little bit of examination, instead of just saying, haven't all societies been capitalistic? No, that's not true. But it's a way of understanding interactions that is easy to lay over all of this other information, so you get kind of a uniform perception. And I think ultimately our society is confronting materialism. So to talk about that, you've got to kind of have that like baseline, like what do these like words mean? And I think that's kind of a subject that Paul was really excited about getting to, and
Poor Paul.
his connection went out.
I know. I was
going
to ask you guys, where do we start here? Where do you tell these guys to start? Because you just said a whole bunch of more bigly words, and they sound like people's last names,
words, right?
And a bunch of stuff. And I'm guessing Paul was going to give us the big philosophy.
He was going to really lay it down. He was excited about it.
Damn.
Oh, and here he is.
Oh, did we get him back in? Oh, just in time to lay it down.
Hey, buddy.
All right, so Paul.
Sorry, guys.
That's
Lay your
all right.
lexicon on us there, Paul.
Hang on. So here's where we're at, Paul. Let me get you back. We just covered all the things you really wanted to talk about, and now we need a wrap up. Basically, a wrap up on philosophy. And my question is, where do people start? We talked about Plato and all these other people, and then Nietzsche and all that stuff. But and we talked about how we can find usefulness in our philosophy in anything, right? The Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance stuff.
Right.
People that are just lay it down. What did you have to end here? Because you got 10 minutes.
Well, yeah, I guess.
Knock
Okay.
Bro's face off the screen first.
What's that?
There we go.
Oh no, he was moving around. I didn't know what he was doing there. Okay, you ready?
Yeah. All right. So yeah, if I was to tell people to start out like with philosophy, we talked about this when we were trying to discuss this show, and I was all about giving terms and terminology, and that's where I would start, because I always find
There we go.
that these different terms kind of help orient your thought to philosophy. So for instance, like, you should get familiar with terms like epistemology, which is the study of the range and limits and nature and source of knowledge. And get familiar with things like metaphysics, which has to do with it's the study of nature of reality at its deepest level, basically. Or you can study ontology, which is the study of being. Sometimes I have a hard time distinguishing between ontology and metaphysics, but if you learn some about that, maybe we can discuss that later. And then, ethics, aesthetics, basically just learn these terms. And then when you have, as Chris said, you start out with philosophers like Plato, because Plato has a really good way of articulating essential problems that we always take for granted. So I think Plato, in the Republic, Plato's tackling justice. In the Euthyphro, Plato's tackling moral realism. And so these are basic fundamental questions that ring throughout all of philosophy. And so once you get familiar with Plato, then you can move on, and you learn as you can learn philosophy as you learn the progression through these philosophical minds. And like, essentially, I think it was Bertrand Russell said that philosophy is nothing but footnotes to Plato. And so if you know Plato, you have a jumping off point for almost all the major philosophical questions.
Exactly.
That you can look forward to. So
that's
where a good place to start is always to just start with Plato, and like Chris said, and then let him present you with all the concepts, and then go from there.
Yeah, maybe do Aristotle. Aristotle's rough.
Did you guys talk about Deleuze?
No, we haven't talked about any of those things. I figured we'd store that up for you.
Well, yeah, if like that's what I was going to discuss, is like my personal philosophy is actually influenced primarily by Deleuze. And what Deleuze says philosophy is as a practice or as an enterprise, is philosophy is the enterprise of creating concepts.
Right.
And he thinks that is distinct from the enterprise of science and the enterprise of art. And he thinks that distinguishing between these different disciplines is valuable in understanding what philosophy is. So what he says, science has to do with functionality and laws, and art has to do with percepts, as in perceptions, and aesthetics. And then philosophy has to do with concept creation. So we discussed earlier the forms with Plato, how Plato thinks that there are actually concepts out in nature that we must discover.
Yeah.
Deleuze would look at that contrarily and say, actually, they're not in nature. We create concepts, and there's a creative component to philosophy that's why I don't like calling philosophy just merely thinking, because I think there is a creative component to it.
Right.
And I think another cool thing that Deleuze doesn't explicitly state, but I think is implied throughout his philosophy is also the formulation of rigorous and complex questions, and that once you've asked a good question, most of your philosophical work has been done.
Right. Exactly. It should be, the answer should be implicit in the question.
Yep.
Uh-huh. That's Giles Deleuze.
I think it's Giles or I don't know, man. Giles. According to Deleuze, you could probably pronounce it any fucking way you want.
Right. And he just died 20 years ago.
No, I think he died maybe 80s. I want to say. I know that he was in a lot of pain. Yeah, I can't remember all the details of his death.
Guittari, is he alive?
Felix Guattari, I want to say, is dead as well, but I don't know as much about him.
Yeah, they were pretty recent French dudes, right?
Oh yeah, he dons the clothes of a post-structuralist, but he's very different, I think, from most post-structuralists because he's way more forgiving. He's not like Derrida, where it's just like fucking everything is stupid and everything you say can be, completely torn apart. I think Deleuze wants, and what I like is he wants things to be interesting. He wants things to be cool.
Uh-huh. Sweet. Ash, we're talking about personal philosophies. You got...
no, it's been, I haven't read Deleuze and Guattari. Honestly, I remember when Paul was all hyped on him, but I was like, no, man, you lost me. I audited the phenomenology class and I was like, God.
Oh yeah, you took Merleau-Ponty with me. I forgot about that. That was a class that changed my life, man.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one. We'll have to talk about that.
It's a class called phenomenology.
What is phenomenology, Paul?
I just want to go phenomenon. Can I just do that?
Yeah, phenomenology. I would say define phenomenology as the study of what we experience precisely as we experience it prior to any presuppositions or predications.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Ooh. So what do you do with that? You kind of find yourself infinitely renaming and redefining something based on its present capacity? Like a sword can be a plowshare in potential. Is this kind of like a big mixture of Plato and
yeah, I mean, it divulges. I mean, it at least grows out of that tradition. I think phenomenology is kind of one of the last gasps of rigorous continental philosophy and not going the analytic route.
Right.
I mean, actually, that's what phenomenology precisely is it's like an alternative to analytic philosophy. Which we don't need to get into all those distinctions. Eventually, we can.
Well, analytic philosophy is really boring, and I don't know what to do with it. So that's what drove me away from philosophy. So
we should get to Trey's personal philosophy. Sorry, Trey.
No, I think we've gone over it. I had only intended to talk about how it relates to how we self-identify, and I was going to talk about how the labels that we put on our own selves, like I'm a father, a husband, a videographer, progressive, but they tell people about kick-ass,
stripper, amateur.
But I do it all. DVDA, but so that all not only tells, if I self-identify as those things, I'm labeling myself, which I don't really like to do, but it at least gives people an idea of who I am, how I define myself, which kind of goes back again to these terms. It ties in with it that if you have a starting point of, okay, here's a common definition of, well, for one thing, I had these fallacies that I wanted to share with you guys. I don't know how to drop a link in chat, but it was a cool little sheet about what is your logical fallacy, and it lays them out in a neat little way with these little icons and stuff like that. But finding these definitions, these ways that people understand the definition and you understand when you are using things improperly or properly, then you can have a conversation about it. But until then, until we define
Normalizing terms.
what father is,
Right.
I'm Emma's father. Well, what does that mean legally? What does it mean societally? What does it mean biologically? And so there are all these different factors to the labels that we give ourselves. And like John was saying earlier, can you be anything but a progressive and still be a philosopher? Do conservatives ask these kind of questions? And I don't know. I think you can self-identify certainly as fiscally conservative,
Right.
still be a thinking person. It depends on, I don't know, but that's, again, that goes back to making sure that we all are on the same page as far as how we've defined our terms and we've defined our labels for ourselves and each other.
I think.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Paul. I think that the phenomenon of the word "like" is an example of this like loss of language, where you don't feel like you ever really have a good handle on what the word is supposed to mean. So you're constantly modifying it. Like, it's almost that close, but it's like kind of not. I think it's a cry, but I think it's also a very healthy expression of trying to enrich your language by flourishing it, by adding new life to it. I think a plant makes itself more eloquent by its growth, and I think that that's what people do with language, is that they find new meaning and new description through more words that they use. And so while we don't have the most succinct language, we do have a very rich and a lot of possibility in our language. We have a rich language and a very prosperous language.
I was arguing to somebody about the Ebonics the other day, because they were like, Ebonics ruined the English language. I was like, oh, you think that? Like, how many other terms has every other generation of everything made up, from groovy to whatever, like now what do they say, ginormous? We're always like
Huge.
Giving words, like making words have babies. And now with things like Twitter, we have to think even harder about like how we condense these things.
Oh, it's worse.
We're just going to be like just a series of grunts and clicks. Maybe the Bushmen of the Kalahari can have it.
We have emoji language. That's really what's coming in. And the word literally has a definition that is an antonym.
It literally does.
Definition number 2 is now not literal.
Wow.
But it's used as a euphemism, literally, all the time. So you guys have a few more minutes to wrap. It's 8 o'clock. We're going to run late anyway. But
I wanted to say sorry to you guys. I've been watching the chat and like watching you guys, and I want to incorporate. I hope we've been engaging for you. I can tell that you're staying with us, but I want to bring you guys in more and ask more questions of you. We'd love to hear from you after the fact, though, because most of you guys are on Slack, and you can leave us messages and things like that. You know where to find us. Anyway, but we'd love to hear your feedback on what you think works about the show and what doesn't, and what you would like to see as a topic. I even had this form made up, but as John pointed out, and I felt in my heart, the questions were really dumb. They were really bad. But we'll ask you good questions at some point, and we'll engage you more in the conversation. But this was kind of a talk at you kind of session, just so, again, to get everybody on the same page, and so we have an idea of where we're going with future discussions.
Well, real quick, you had a lot of people that loved what was going on, but it was really heavy shit, and they had to go because it was late. And
totally.
So they're like, I love this, but my brain, ow.
Totally.
So, thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. So in 2 weeks, we're doing this again in 2 weeks.
Totally.
Good and evil.
Good and evil.
And everybody.
I don't know who's going to be who yet.
What?
Which one's going to be which? Who's going to be good and who's going to be evil? I get to be the bad or the ugly.
Oh, I see how we're going here.
Can I be the devil's advocate? Because that's what I'm going to do.
Go for it.
going to be the
You'll
producer
have
and
to tell me
just
if
shut
that
the,
was good or
the show off.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
weeks.
See you
Thanks,
guys
everyone.
later. Have a
Bye,
good week.
everybody.